From his legendary first appearance in 1962's Amazing Fantasy issue 15, the character of Spider-Man has been one of the flagship heroes of the Marvel Universe. Often depicted as the company's preeminent everyman, Peter Parker is no stranger to adversity and hardship throughout his life, whether it be the losses of Uncle Ben, Gwen Stacy and Harry Osborn, or the real-world trials and tribulations he faces each day whilst trying to juggle his heroics. Despite these problems though, Spider-Man has often remained one of the more light-hearted characters that Marvel Comics has, an unwavering beacon of hope and optimism despite the many problems that he faces. However, this doesn't make the friendly neighbourhood superhero exempt from being part of incredibly dark and somber stories, and in my opinion, there's no greater example of this than DeMatteis and Mike Zeck's 1987 comic KRAVEN'S Last Hunt. This story is widely regarded to be one of the greatest Spider-Man comic books of all time, and an era-defining story for Marvel themselves. It's a storyline that combines the inspirational nature of classic Spidey adventures with genuinely complex and dark emotional themes, making for a 6-issue saga truly unlike anything that's happened to Peter Parker either before or since. And in this video, I want to break down the history of just how this story came to be, what the original ideas were behind DeMatteis and Zeck's bold new idea to test the web-slinger to his limit, and ultimately what makes KRAVEN'S Last Hunt one of the very best Spider-Man stories ever told. Before we continue though, just a quick reminder to leave a like on this video if you enjoy it, and subscribe to Owen Likes Comics so you don't miss out on any future videos. In order to understand how KRAVEN'S Last Hunt came to be, it's first important to get a sense of the comic's writer, DeMatteis, and his process when attempting to bring this story to life. You see, DeMatteis broke into the comics industry in the late 1970s, where he first worked on producing horror books for DC Comics. He would then begin working at Marvel in the early 1980s, when the company's then editor-in-chief, Jim Shooter, appointed him as the new writer of both The Defenders and Captain America. Beginning in 1981, his run on Captain America would be the first chapter in his long-running collaboration with artist Mike Zeck. From here, DeMatteis would become a major name in the comic book industry, with the success on books like Captain America, The Defenders and Namor giving him the freedom to pitch more ambitious stories. Specifically, it was during this time that DeMatteis came up with an interesting idea for Wonder Man, pitching to Tom DeFalco a story that would see the hero be attacked and buried by his villainous half-brother, the Grim Reaper, forcing him to escape from his grave and overcome his longtime foe. As DeMatteis would later explain on his website,
"It was a long road from the first glimmer of inspiration, somewhere around 1984 or 85, to the final published work. If it had been up to me, and thank goodness it wasn't, the original idea would have seen print as, of all things, a Wonder Man miniseries. Simon Williams, defeated in battle by his brother the Grim Reaper, awakens in a coffin, claws his way out, and discovers that he's been buried alive for months. But the story knew better. It knew that it needed time to brew in my unconscious, and find the proper form. Tom DeFalco, then Marvel's executive editor, agreed. When I pitched him my Wonder Man idea, he promptly rejected it, but there was something in that return from the grave concept that wouldn't let go."
Believing that such a story had clear potential, DeMatteis would actually take it over to DC Comics, proposing a new version in which Batman is buried by the Joker, and that believing he had finally killed his arch enemy, the Clown Prince of Crime would effectively turn sane. Arguably, this new approach would have likely fared better, given that Batman's comics were becoming increasingly dark and psychologically driven throughout the mid to late 1980s, culminating in stories like A Death of the Family, The Dark Knight Returns, and The Killing Joke. And although DeMatteis' pitch would have most likely fit in nicely with these other stories, it was actually its similarities to books like The Killing Joke that caused DC to reject his proposal, with Batman group editor Len Wein already having received Alan Moore's pitch and found DeMatteis' ideas to overlap with The Killing Joke in many ways. Although it should be noted that DeMatteis' Batman pitch would later be released in 1994, under the name Going Sane. Nevertheless, feeling somewhat dejected, DeMatteis would temporarily drop the idea and return to his regular writing duties at Marvel. However, in 1986, he would be approached by DeFalco and Jim Owsley, then the editor of the Spider-Man comic line, about potentially taking over on the Spectacular Spider-Man comic series. Now, at first, J.M. and DeMatteis actually rejected this offer, believing that he couldn't commit to writing another monthly title. However, upon realizing that this could be his gateway to bringing his original Wonder Man pitch to life, he changed his mind and eventually accepted. While Spider-Man may have been the third superhero to be fit into this story, DeMatteis found that Peter Parker was actually the perfect protagonist for it, as his close encounter with death and subsequent escape would feel even more high stakes given the character's recent marriage to Mary Jane Watson. As DeMatteis writes,
I now had another chance, probably my last chance, to take a crack at this back from the grave idea. More important, I discovered as I worked away on the proposal that Spider-Man, recently married to Mary Jane, was a far better choice than either Wonder Man or Batman. Peter Parker is perhaps the most emotionally and psychologically authentic protagonist in any superhero universe. Underneath that mask, he's as confused, as flawed, as touchingly human as the people who read and write about him. The quintessential everyman. And that everyman's love for his new wife, for the new life they were building together, was the emotional fuel that ignited the story. It was Mary Jane's presence, her heart and soul, that reached down into the depths of Peter's heart and soul, forcing him up out of that coffin, out of the grave, into the light. And that's how Kraven's Last Hunt was born.
Reteaming with artist Mike Zeck, DeMatteis began fleshing out the details for what this ambitious story would entail. Initially, Kraven the Hunter wasn't actually considered to be the villain. Instead, the pair considered creating a brand new foe who would be capable of pushing Spider-Man to his absolute limits. However, coming up with ideas for this new villain proved challenging, and upon consulting the Marvel Universe Handbook for ideas, DeMatteis soon found himself becoming fascinated with Kraven, drawing comparisons between the character and the work of writer Fyodor Dostoevsky, particularly his books Crime and Punishment and The Brothers Karamazov, and realised that he could use the Russian villain to explore the same themes of duality and humanity that Dostoevsky had in his works. Although Jim Owsley was initially hesitant to allow the pair to use Kraven in the story, preferring the original idea of a brand new villain, gave Zeck and DeMatteis the benefit of the doubt, allowing Kraven to take centre stage and be the man to finally hunt down Spider-Man. As the pair then began outlining the plans for each of the 6 issues of Spectacular Spider-Man that the story would be told in, Marvel Editorial made the decision to expand it to all 3 of the ongoing Spider-Man comics, believing that the impact of Peter's near-death experience would be lessened if other stories were being told concurrently. Therefore, DeMatteis and Zeck would not only continue to work on Spectacular, but also take over both the long-running Amazing Spider-Man title, as well as the recently launched Web of Spider-Man series, stretching their ambitious story across every corner of the Spider-Man universe. And with this, in October of 1987, the first chapter in their 6-part saga would be released, in the form of Web of Spider-Man issue 31, where the ominous Kraven the Hunter would make his grand entrance, setting the stage for a story that would shake the Spider-Man landscape to its very core. The first part of this story, as told in Web of Spider-Man issue 31, opens with our introduction to Kraven the Hunter, as we see him standing naked in his trophy room, wrestling with various animals as he prepares himself for his next challenge. Kraven then exits the room, where we see that his assistants are digging a grave. Kraven laments that his life will soon come to an end, before he grabs a Spider-Man mask from the coffin, declaring the web slinger his next and potentially final hunt. From here, we cut to Spider-Man as he arrives at a funeral of his own, this one for the street snitch Joe Face. As several criminals attempt to spoil the funeral, Peter stops them and pays respect to Joe, leaving money beside his coffin to pay for a proper burial. Later that night, Peter, unable to sleep, swings throughout New York City, thinking about his own mortality as well as those close to him that he has lost over the years. It's here that Kraven's ambush begins, as the hero is shot with a tranquilizer dart. Initially, Peter falls and starts to hallucinate, seeing visions of Joe Face before coming to and seeing Kraven standing over him. Peter initially attempts to fight the villain, but is easily overpowered, with Kraven catching the hero in a net before shooting him with a rifle. Claiming his prize, Kraven brings Spider-Man's body back to his mansion, tossing it into the grave seen at the beginning and burying the web slinger 6 feet below. With Spider-Man presumed dead, Kraven decides to claim a trophy from his victory, donning the hero's costume and laughing maniacally. As Kraven begins to believe that he is actually Spider-Man, we see Mary Jane worrying for Peter's safety, leaving their apartment and going out looking for her husband. As she does though, she's followed by two mysterious men, before MJ is miraculously saved by Spider-Man. This familiar sight soon turns sour though, as she quickly realises that this isn't Peter Parker, due to how brutal and aggressive this Spider-Man is. She attempts to confront him, but Kraven leaps away before she can get close, leaving MJ alone and concerned for her husband's safety. As this is happening, we see that underground, the villainous Vermin and his swarm of rats have been kidnapping several women from across New York City, bringing them into his lair in the sewers. Hearing footsteps above, Vermin recounts a previous battle with Spider-Man, choosing to emerge from the sewers and attempting to exact revenge on his apparent tormentor. While Vermin and his army of rats begin to terrorise the city streets, Kraven believes that stopping him will truly cement himself as the superior Spider-Man, leading to Kraven confronting Vermin in his base in the sewers and handedly beating him into unconsciousness. To demonstrate his clear superiority, Kraven brings Vermin's body back with him. However, as he does, we see a swarm of spiders begin to emerge near Peter's grave, as a hand suddenly bursts through the ground, signalling that our beloved hero is somehow still alive. Peter slowly rises from the grave, fueled by his love for Mary Jane, and stumbles into Kraven's mansion, where he discovers newspapers discussing the villain's actions whilst masquerading as Spider-Man. After briefly returning home to reunite with MJ, Peter goes out searching for Kraven, confronting him while still dressed as Spider-Man. Initially, Kraven tells Peter to attack him, explaining that he's already won in his own mind and proved himself to be the ultimate apex predator, having done to Spider-Man what no one else could. The pair fight their way back to Kraven's mansion, where the hunter removes the spider costume, and we see that Vermin has been detained within an electrical cage. During the encounter between Peter and Kraven, Vermin escapes the cage and attacks Spider-Man, with Kraven encouraging them to fight to the death. For a second, Peter succumbs to his anger, beating Vermin before he's able to restrain himself and come to his senses. Refusing to fight any longer, Spider-Man is quickly overwhelmed by Vermin, before Kraven instructs him to cease fighting and flee. As Vermin scurries out of the mansion, Peter is actually helped to his feet by Kraven, who informs him that he's passed his test and should go and chase Vermin down. Realising that Peter is the true hero of this story, Kraven admits that from this point onwards, he will hunt no longer. Spider-Man reluctantly leaves Kraven in his mansion, promising to return and hunt him down if he ever goes back on his word. As Peter leaps from the window, Kraven walks through the empty halls of his family mansion, reminiscing of his childhood and his life back in Russia, believing his life's work is now finally complete. And with this, Kraven picks up his trusty rifle, the same one he used to shoot Spider-Man earlier, and places the barrel in his own mouth, choosing to take his own life as his body falls into the open coffin and blood splatters on his treasured family photo to signify the completion of his last hunt. I don't think it's hyperbole for me to say that Kraven's Last Hunt is unlike any Spider-Man story that came before it. While there have certainly been many incredibly dark stories told throughout the character's history, the image of Spider-Man being shot and buried alive by Kraven is one that has remained fixed in the minds of comic fans ever since it first happened. However, while this is admittedly a dark story, it isn't one without deep meaning and symbolism. You see, Kraven's Last Hunt was told throughout 1987, being released only 1 year after comics like Watchmen and The Dark Knight Returns. This was a period in which comic books across the board were becoming increasingly darker, and writer James DeMatteis used this changing tone to tell a story that examined how mortality and the fear of death informs so many different aspects of Spider-Man's character. From his introduction on the very first page, we see that Kraven himself is incredibly aware of his own mortality, and his quest to bury and replace Spider-Man is not to extend his life, but to create a legacy that will live beyond him. And while Kraven seeks a meaningful death, it's Spider-Man's desire to live and continue the life that he and Mary Jane had built together that carries him out of his grave and back into reclaiming the mantle. Additionally, this comic also serves as something of a critique of this darker trend of storytelling, as DeMatteis sought to use Kraven becoming the new Spider-Man as an example of these more violent and morally ambiguous anti-heroes that would begin to rise in popularity. As DeMatteis would explain,
what Kraven plans to do is kill Spider-Man and then take his place. Prove that he can be a better Spider-Man than Spider-Man. What he becomes, of course, is not Spider-Man, but what he perceives Spider-Man to be. In a sense, what Kraven becomes is something akin to Frank Miller's Dark Knight character. One of the things about Peter Parker with Spider-Man is that he doesn't just put on a mask and become the Spider-Man. He doesn't become transformed into this dark creature of the night. No matter what costume he has, no matter what he does, Peter Parker is always a very human, passionate, caring guy. Kraven doesn't know that, and that is the major difference here.
Understanding this idea is pivotal to explaining why Kraven's Last Hunt is such a timeless story. At its heart, this comic is all about tragedy, as well as pushing the Spider-Man mythos into uncharted territories, forcing readers to really consider the psychology at the heart of the friendly neighborhood hero. Throughout each of the 6 issues, we're reminded that what makes Peter Parker an incredible superhero is his humanity, encapsulated in the book by his love for Mary Jane Watson. And when that humanity is taken away, the meaning of Spider-Man is lost with it. When Kraven adopts the Spider moniker, he does so whilst fundamentally misunderstanding what it truly means, seeking simply to become a predator and hunt down criminals without considering the hope, bravery and compassion that encapsulates and defines the wall crawler. This battle for humanity is demonstrated by the two's fate, as Kraven's quest for death and Peter's struggle to live results in Spider-Man becoming an even greater hero by the end of it, as Spider-Man chooses to embrace humanity and love in order to survive, while Kraven rejects it in favour of taking his own life. Therefore, the comic's message that by choosing to embrace life and all that it brings, we too can survive what may come, is quintessential Spider-Man storytelling at its very core. And despite its dark tone and premise, I think that's what makes Kraven's Last Hunt an incredible story of triumph and heroism. And combined with the long and storied history that DeMatteis had trying to bring it to life, it's what, in my opinion, truly makes it one of the greatest Spider-Man comics of all time. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please make sure to leave a like on the video and leave a comment down below as well. Let me know your thoughts on everything we talked about in today's video. I can't wait to hear what you have to say as always. If you're new to Owen Likes Comics, please make sure to hit the subscribe button and the notify bell so you don't miss out on any future videos. And if you want some more videos, there should be some on screen right now that you might also enjoy. If you want to help support the channel and help me make more videos, you can do so over at patreon.com/OwenLikesComics. And if you want some more of me, you can follow me on Twitter just at Owen Likes Comics. That's all for this video though. Again, thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully I'll see you next time. But until then, take care and keep reading.